I think the problem is if parents get all freaked out whenever a touchy issue comes up on their TV or in a movie or something, and they don't want to talk about it, they clam up. Do you think your kid is ever going to come to you again to talk about these issues? No, he or she never is, right? They're going to run to their friends or the internet or TikTok or something like that. So I think we need to inoculate kids rather than isolate kids.
Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. Please take a moment and click subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, because we have some great interviews and videos coming up next week. We're going to be talking with Scott Klusendorf, who does so much great work in the area of pro-life apologetics. We're going to be talking about, when you go on social media and you make a claim, maybe something against abortion or pro-life, what is the pushback that you're going to receive? We're going to talk with Scott about how to engage with the objections people are going to bring to your pro-life arguments. So definitely subscribe. Click the bell icon on YouTube so that you know when those things are coming up. But I'm really excited to bring you this conversation today with one of our favorites, Dr. Frank Turek. He's written a book recently with his son, Zach Turek, called Hollywood Heroes: How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God. This is a book that I was honored to be able to endorse and happily did so. I think that it touches on so many important points. And so I just want to read a little bit from the intro here, because I think you're going to see, especially if you're a Christian parent, this book is not written for Christian parents. It's written for Christians to be able to discern through the movies and media that we watch, and even find some themes in those things that can help us build bridges with people and begin to have gospel conversations with people. But I think especially if you're a parent, this is going to mean a lot to you, this episode. So here's what it says. Think about it. What if Batman knew your name and wanted to be friends with you? What if you were the one Tony Stark died to save? What if it was you Luke Skywalker would stop at nothing to redeem? Hollywood Heroes will awaken you to these questions and help you see the God who stops at nothing to redeem you. And it will strengthen you to invite others into conversations of faith and life in Jesus. So, Frank, welcome on. I'm so glad to have you on again and talking about this new book.
Yeah, it's always great. This book's fun. I'm excited about the book because my son, who's really the movie buff, Alisa, I mean, he started out early on when I think he was like 9 or 10 when the Phantom Menace came out with Star Wars. He went to the movies,
sure.
And everybody was dressed up, and he's going, "Wow, this is amazing." Well, I was 15 when the first Star Wars movie came out, and the same thing was going on. People were dressing up. I'm like, this is more than just a movie, isn't it? And so he's the real movie buff. And a few years back, we said, there's so many Christian parallels in so many of these movies, and so many of these movie heroes are patterned after the ultimate hero, Jesus. I said, why shouldn't we talk about this and get people who are interested in these movies to realize that the greatest story ever told is retold many times in their favorite movies?
That's such an important point, too, I think, because there's a reason these movies resonate with people. In my next book that's coming out in October, I have a chapter where I'm sort of interacting with the lie that you should put yourself first, because this is something that culture tells us constantly. Like, you have to make sure all your needs are met first before you can meet the needs of others, and you should put yourself first. And I referenced that old movie, I don't know if you remember this, with Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck, called Armageddon, where like at the end, only one person has to go and stop the meteor from hitting the earth, and Bruce Willis sends Ben Affleck back up, and he's like, I'll do it. And then there's this big dramatic scene where Bruce Willis dies for the whole world. And I tell that story and I say, wouldn't it be like so stupid if Bruce Willis was like, you know what? I think, I've got a lot of dreams I still need to pursue, and I'm going to go ahead and let you do this, but nobody would think that's a good movie. And I think there's a reason that those themes resonate so deeply with us. Like, nobody would pay money to go see Bruce Willis save his own skin. It was a blockbuster because he gave his life, right?
Or if Tony Stark said, "Look, I'm following my heart. I need to go back to Pepper. I'm not going to kill
Right.
myself here."
Well, and the thing with Tony Stark too is if people are familiar with the movies, and we'll get into this too, is that Tony Stark would have every reason to let somebody else do it. He's crazy smart. He's the one that's actually inventing all of the not costumes, but what do they call them in the Marvel
technology.
universe? The technology that they wear and SpiderMan suit and all that. He's the one designing all that. Nobody else can do that. And yet we still know that that is what heroes do. And so that, of course, points to the real story, the bigger story, the real true story that we have such an opportunity to talk with people about, when we talk about Marvel movies, or especially like I loved the first Wonder Woman. I know we'll get to all of this. I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But first, Frank, I want to know, this book you co-wrote with your son, Zach, what was that like to write a book with your son? I imagine that was just, if I knew 10, 15 years from now, I was going to co-write a book with my daughter, I would be over the moon excited that my daughter would be even interested in doing something like that. And then how that would actually go. So how did it come to be? And then how did that process work as you guys wrote the book together?
Well, Zach in his own right is an apologist because he's already graduated from seminary, even though he's in the Air Force. He's a major in the Air Force right now. He's in intelligence. And he's been, for the past several months, working 13-hour days on the Russia issue. So he's really busy right now. Otherwise, he'd probably be on this with us. But this had to be 5-6 years ago. He grew up on these movies. He grew up on Star Wars. In fact, Alisa, he used to read all of the Star Wars fiction books that came out of the Star Wars universe. They weren't ever made into movies, but there's a whole secret world of these things. And he read all those books. I know he read all the Harry Potter books, and I know Harry Potter's controversial. We'll get to that later. He just loved reading. And then when the movies came out, he loved them all the more. And 5-6 years ago, we were just talking about it. And I said, Zach, you know a lot about these movies. You know about parallels to Christianity. We ought to write a book. And given the fact that we've both been really busy, it took quite a while to pull it all together. But in 2021, we just put our minds to it and got it done. He's actually in Anchorage, Alaska. I'm here in Charlotte, North Carolina. So it's all been via email and via FaceTime and everything. And but it's been wonderful writing it with him, and we're just excited to see it out. It's just come out May 3rd, so it's just hot off the presses, and we're excited to see what it does, because I think it's going to be helpful not just for evangelism, but it's also going to be helpful, as you pointed out earlier, Alisa, with parents and their kids. If their kids love these movies. Why not find an easy way to segue these movies into getting them more interested in God, Christianity, and biblical life lessons?
Totally agree. And so, we kind of hinted at that this is going to be really beneficial for Christian parents. But when you were writing this book, what was the audience you had in mind? Was this just Christians in general, or were you writing it even to skeptics to take a look at the gospel? Or who are you thinking about when you were writing this book?
Well, anybody that likes superhero movies would probably like the book. In fact, even an atheist I debated on Justin Brierly's show enjoyed the book because Paul Enns is his name. He and I went back and forth on some of the apologetic issues, which he obviously doesn't agree with us that Jesus rose from the dead, but he enjoyed the books. He actually worked for George Lucas, so he enjoyed the Star Wars chapter, the Harry Potter chapter. So even people that might not be Christians could benefit from it and like it. But I actually think that it's great for any person that likes superhero movies. And it's certainly good for kids and their parents, particularly their parents or youth pastors who want to get kids more engaged in Christianity. I think they can use this book as a segue to do that.
Yeah, and there's a mentality. I want to address the mentality that, different people approach these movies in different ways, especially in the context of Christian parenting. And I think there's sort of a spectrum. So you have some parents who say, we're not going to allow any Disney. We're not going to allow, of course, I know the whole Disney thing is, we're rethinking those things just from the recent, revelations about that. But just in general, things like Marvel and superhero movies and there's one group of parents that would say, we are not going to allow any of that, and we're just going to totally isolate. And here's why I think this is a danger. I think I meet people. I met this couple on the road when I was speaking at a conference, and they said, our parents never let us watch any secular movies. And so the minute we got out of the house, we had this marathon and we watched all the movies. And I thought to myself, goodness, I get where the parents were coming from. I have so much. Oh my gosh, I'm in it with all of you Christian parents who are watching. We are navigating this stuff every day. So every parent's going to make a different decision for themselves, of course. But I was thinking about that going, man, what a missed opportunity to be able to actually teach their kids how to discern through some of these issues. So you have that one end of the extreme. And then on another end of the extreme, you have parents saying, hey, I'm just going to throw anything up there on the screen and try to find the gospel in it. So where would you find the sweet spot of where this book is hitting on that spectrum as far as how you would approach parents to navigate these topics with their own kids?
Well, first of all, I trust parents. Parents know their kids better than I do. So whatever they decide, that's up to them. Okay. But secondly, I think that, as you just said, you can use this as a segue or a bridge to get kids and even their friends more interested in Christianity. But not every movie is age appropriate. In fact, we have a list in the front of Hollywood Heroes. In the preface, we have a list of, okay, here are the movies we're going to talk about. Not all these may be age appropriate. You're not going to show your 5-year-old maybe some of these movies, but the time they're 12 or 13, maybe you will. But overall, Alisa, I think the best approach with these kind of PG-13 movies, if their kids are interested in them, is to watch it with them and to point out the good and the bad in it and explain what's good and explain what's bad. I love what your guest Oz Guinness talks about. I know you had him on the show recently. He plays a game with his kids or grandkids now, I guess, called Spot the Lie, right? So if you're watching something with your kid and say you see, okay, premarital sex and there's no negative consequences, everyone's happy. Okay, what's being taught here, kids? And is it true or false? Is there a lie here? And then you discuss it, right? I think the problem is if parents get all freaked out whenever a touchy issue comes up on their TV or in a movie or something, and they don't want to talk about it, they clam up. Do you think your kid is ever going to come to you again to talk about these issues? No, he or she never is, right? They're going to run to their friends or the internet or TikTok or something like that. So I think we need to inoculate kids rather than isolate kids. That's the best way I could put it.
I agree with that so heartily. And I do think it's interesting that there's kind of an age appropriate, like you mentioned, a way to do that. Mm-hmm. One of the moms that was she was in one of the Mama Bear apologetics groups on Facebook, and she made such a clear point, and I wish I could go back and remember who she was so I could credit her for this thought, but it was so brilliant. And she had grown children, and she said, the way I was raised and the way I raised my kids was that if it was quote unquote clean, they could watch it. And what that meant was if there's no graphic sexuality and if there's no cuss words, we can watch it. The problem with that, though, as she pointed out, was that she said, my kids literally had their worldview formed by the show Friends and Gilmore Girls. So you have a lot of subject matter that's being discussed and even worldviews that are being promoted in different TV shows and in movies that even if there's not actual cuss words or actual graphic sex scenes, they can become completely maybe uncritically accepting of worldviews that are very, very antithetical to the gospel. So this is what we argue in the Mama Bear Apologetics book, is that, we need to expose our kids to false ideas. And that models for them, not only is there really no such thing as a movie that's all good or all bad, it kind of gets them out of that black and white thinking to think in a little bit more complicated terms and nuances of, hey, what this character did was a good thing. And the movie actually showed the consequence of that being good. But Frank, just this week, once in a while, I like to just catch up with what culture is into because I don't have a ton of time to watch TV. Of course, once in a while I do. I'll get into a little binge on something, of course. But I took a really popular show. It's wildly popular in culture right now and just watched it cold. So I'm not the frog in the kettle on this. And it was so stunning to me how in the show, the person who put themselves first and you basically put other people's needs behind them, they did it in such a way that, like, you're supposed to be crying. You're supposed to be so moved by this. They've got the music. And I remember watching it going, I am literally supposed to be crying right now, but I can't squeeze out a tear because this is so horrible what this person is doing. And so this is why I think it's so important for all of us to learn to think this way, but also to help our kids think this way. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and ask you a question because I want you to give us some practical examples in some of these movies. So one of the big topics that in apologetics that we have to deal with and answer is this problem of if God is good, why does he allow so much evil and suffering in the world? And you actually point out an example from SpiderMan of how we can think through this. Why don't you help us with that?
Yeah, the Spider-Man is born after he's bitten by a spider, we all know, and he's using his powers, at least initially, for his own personal benefit. He's just a teenager with cool powers, so he's going to use it to impress girls and that kind of thing, you know. And his Uncle Ben, who brings him up, at one point says to him, Ben is starting to get an idea that something's happened to Peter Parker. And Ben says to him, with great power comes great responsibility, right? And what happens is Peter Parker, as Spider-Man, could stop a robbery from happening, but the guy who was being robbed had just duped Spider-Man out of something. So he doesn't save the guy. He says, this guy got what he deserved. He just duped me. Now I'm going to let this robber rob him. Well, it turns out the robber who robbed this guy actually carjacked Peter Parker's Uncle Ben and shot him. And Peter Parker goes to him. Uncle Ben's dying on the sidewalk. And what he remembers, Peter Parker does in his mind, is with great power comes great responsibility. Here's an evil event that occurs, and his uncle dies, and suddenly Spider-Man realizes, I haven't been using my powers rightly. From now on, I'm going to use it for good. So here's an evil event that actually produces a good. What's the good? Spider-Man becomes someone who's going to look after others, and then he goes on to save thousands of people. So the evil event, the killing of his uncle, actually is the catalyst which brings forth great good from that point going forward. So there's always a ripple effect. There's always, even when evil occurs, there's always a ripple effect, and it often brings good down the line. And here's a case of that. God has to allow free will to allow love, but he allows evil to occur, but he can actually redeem evil for good. And here's an example where he does.
Yeah, and I mentioned before that it seems like the messages or the slogans we hear from culture, things like, you're perfect just as you are, you should put yourself first, you're in control of your own destiny. This is the message we get in some of the top-selling books. And yet, when people go to the movie theater for entertainment, I'm always stunned. Now, of course, there's some of that in the more dramatic shows like the one I mentioned, but in these hero shows, these ones, these are the superheroes, these are the good guys, these are the guys that are saving the world, which basically rests on an assumption that it's good to save the world, right? Because if you're really going by a Darwinian evolutionary paradigm, then you would maybe see Thanos as the hero for kind of thinning the herd a little bit so that we can let the earth thrive a little more. And yet, nobody would think that's a good movie. And so there seems to be this tension between what we instinctively are drawn to as morally good and what is actually being claimed as morally good. But I think as we see more and more people buying into the bad ideas, we see our culture just getting more and more crazy. And so, you take somebody like a Captain America, who is, really so in many ways antithetical to what we see happening in culture. And you point out a really unique characteristic that Captain America has, and you kind of relate that with Jesus. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, Captain America is righteous from the beginning. He doesn't need any moral development. You never have to worry. What is Captain America going to do here? Is he going to do the right thing or not? No, he's always going to do the right thing. Like Jesus always does the right thing. Now, of course, Jesus is morally perfect. Captain America isn't morally perfect, but he's always going to do the right thing. Now, you put him up against his co-star, Iron Man. Tony Stark is the opposite, right? Tony Stark starts out as a billionaire, playboy, amoral arms dealer who he's the last guy you think is going to be a hero, right? He's in it for himself all the time. And yet over the series of movies, he goes on this character arc where he actually gives up what he truly wants to follow with his heart. He has actually an identity crisis because he has everything to live with and nothing to live for. And until he discovers what he ought to really be living for, he's selfish. Then he becomes a hero. And spoiler alert, he actually sacrifices himself to save the world. So he's going on an arc to becoming more and more like Jesus over the long term, whereas Captain America is consistent the whole way through.
Well, you mentioned Tony Stark, and of course, for anyone unfamiliar with the movies, he's got these. I can't remember. It's been so long now since I saw the genesis of the Iron Man thing, but he's got this device implanted into his chest, which is keeping him alive. And there's like a couple of scenes where it's really tense because it's like running out of juice or whatever, and they got to quick and fix it. But what is a great reminder with the Tony Stark device that's implanted in his chest? There's a great reminding of a life-changing biblical principle. What is that?
Well, this is one of my favorite parts of the book because if there's one theme that comes through in, say, kids' movies now, and it's all over the culture, it's follow your heart, right? That's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to follow your heart. You're supposed to cross every stream. You're supposed to swim every river. You're supposed to climb every mountain. That's got to be a Disney song somewhere, right? Yeah. And that's what you're supposed to do. And don't let anyone tell you you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to follow your heart. Well, Tony Stark has been following his heart his whole life. He's a billionaire. He's got the big three we always talk about: sex, money, and power, right? He's got all of it. He doesn't need anything else, you would think, temporally, but he's still miserable. He has an identity crisis. He really doesn't know who he is. He has everything to live with and nothing to live for. Then one of his own missiles, which his company sold to terrorists, actually it's detonated near him. And he takes all this shrapnel in his chest, and that's why they have to put that device in his chest to protect his heart, to guard his heart from encroaching shrapnel. If that thing fails, he dies. And I think this is a beautiful picture of what the Proverbs says, Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart because everything you do flows from it. Doesn't say follow your heart. It says guard your heart. And if there's one lesson we need to get to our kids, is it's not follow your heart, it's guard your heart. Tony Stark guards his heart. Here's a visual representation of it. Eventually, he becomes the hero that saves the world. But I think that particular visual picture is something that every kid needs to learn. Every adult needs to learn, by the way, because if you follow your heart without moral restraint, you're going to wind up alone, sick, and ultimately dead.
Absolutely. And I think those visual pictures can be so powerful. I'm thinking in particular of Lord of the Rings. was thinking about this all week. And what an amazing example of what sin does to somebody is Gollum with the ring, my precious. And it's like you see this moral arc with Gollum, almost, starting as a hobbit, but, we would say like as a human, and then becoming more and more dehumanized until all that he is just obsessed with this thing, and I think that these messages in culture, they're actually sending us that way rather than the other way. And so again, in a lot of these stories, here's a great way to think about this. Like if Christian parents are watching this and you're like, well, I don't want to just go show my kids all the Marvel movies. That's fine, but why not have this under your belt so that when your kid goes to a friend's house and they're talking about it, or if your friend happens to see the movie at a friend's house, or they hear the whole story from their friends, why not have these talking points available to be able to point them to why, I think for me, the big question, Frank, is why do we love these stories? Why do these stories resonate so deeply?
I think they resonate so deeply because even anti-Christian movie makers can't help but making movies that parallel the greatest story ever told and the greatest hero in world history. And that's, of course, Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Yeah. Because we all have a desire to have someone rescue us from this broken world and take us to a place where there is no pain, suffering, or death. And that's what Jesus does. See, all of these superhero movies, all of these fantasy movies do that. They have someone come in and save us from this broken world and take us to a place of bliss. And we all have this desire. And C.S. Lewis famously put it this way. He said, if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world.
Yeah.
And we were made for another world. And all these movies, even though these movie makers don't even know they're doing it, are paralleling the greatest story ever told. Now, there are a couple of movies we cover in this series, and in the book, Hollywood Heroes. Here are the movies we cover, or the movie franchises we cover. We cover Captain America, Iron Man, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Star Wars. And the one that is explicitly Christian in its by its author is actually Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Okay. Tolkien was a Catholic who was very devout in his beliefs. And so he's trying to communicate the same kind of worldview in Lord of the Rings that a Christian would. There are other movie makers, directors that put Christian imagery in there in particular. Like, for example, Zack Snyder, when he did Batman versus Superman, if you see the scene where Superman actually tries to take out this character Doomsday, he takes him out with a Krypton-tipped spear. Well, it turns out that Doomsday fights back and pierces Superman in the side, just like Jesus.
Wow, yeah.
And Superman dies. And the next scene, after Superman dies, he's handed down by Batman to Wonder Woman in a manner in which Christ was handed down from the cross. A famous painting. So moviegoers saw this in the theater, and they tweeted Zack Snyder, the director, and they said, "Where'd you get the inspiration for this scene from?" And he tweeted back the picture of Christ being lowered down from the cross. Yeah. So and there's a lot of crosses in that movie, Batman versus Superman. I know a lot of people didn't like it, but that movie, by the way, deals directly with the problem of evil. It's got so much Christian imagery in it. It's really, really interesting. So why not use these movies to communicate the truth to young people?
And this was something that I had to sort of come around to a little bit. I've always been a bit of a black and white thinker. So I would have probably been the person, and sometimes still do. I'll see something and I'm like, that's a miss for me, But I would be the kind of person that would say, don't call this person a Christ figure because there's only one Christ and only Christ is perfect. But the point of calling someone a Christ figure is there's never going to be a perfect metaphor. And I think that's what I've come around to. Even Lord of the Rings, I was hung up on that for so long because I'm thinking there's no, like, who's the Christ figure in Lord of the Rings? Because nobody's, well, yes, right. But nobody's morally perfect is the point. And so that's what I would get hung up on. But I think if we can just say, look, okay, we get it. They're not morally perfect like Christ was, but they're pointing somewhere. They're pointing to a story that we all deeply resonate with. And so let's talk a little bit about Lord of the Rings, because as you mentioned, the author of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, which, by the way, I was just in Chicago and got to visit the, now I can't remember what the museum, it's a tiny little museum that has his desk right there at Wheaton.
Oh, yeah?
I got to see the desk. I got to see G.K. Chesterton's glasses. It was pretty cool. But so Tolkien was the one who convinced C.S. Lewis that Christianity was what he called a true myth.
That's right.
And so I think once I started to realize more about that, I started to kind of get where people were going with these things. So talk to us about, what does it mean, the true myth? What was he talking about?
Yeah, Tolkien noticed that C.S. Lewis always loved stories about dying and rising gods. These are stories that came out after Christianity, and Lewis was enthralled with them. And Tolkien, being a Christian, said to Lewis, "Why are you so enthralled with all these myths about dying and rising gods to save the world, and not enthralled with the true myth, which is written about in the New Testament?" In other words, he convinced Lewis that all these myths that he really likes they're fiction, but the true myth is the one that is recorded in the New Testament. That actually happened. He convinced Lewis of that, and then, as you know, Lewis became probably the greatest apologist of the 20th century. So all of these myths, and the myths that are being made now, Iron Man, Captain America, Lord of the Rings, all these myths are actually in the same way pointing to the true myth. We just have to be astute enough to recognize where they're doing that.
Yeah, now you mentioned there's 3 Christ figures in Lord of the Rings. Talk about those.
Okay, well, the 3 characters that we look at are Gandalf, Aragorn, and Frodo, and Sam. And who do you think Tolkien would say is the hero of the entire Lord of the Rings series? Do you remember?
Well, my guess would be it would be Frodo, but is that wrong?
Close. It's Sam. Yeah,
Yeah.
he would say Sam is
Yeah.
the hero because Sam carries Frodo, right? Which
Yes.
is an
Oh,
illustration of Jesus carrying
yes.
us, right? Okay.
I can't
So,
carry it, but I'll carry you. I think he
right,
says. Oh,
right.
that's
That's
so
right.
good. Yeah.
So Tolkien spreads out the Christ figure amongst these three. You know, Gandalf is actually described as an angel by Tolkien. He's a messenger,
That makes
right? But
sense.
he's
Yeah.
also like a strategist. He's the one that plans salvation. Aragorn is the king to come. He's the returning king. That's of course the third book and the third movie, the returning king. So that's who Jesus is, of course. Frodo is the weak one who is going to actually accomplish salvation simply by dropping a ring in a volcano. And of course, he has to be helped by Sam. So this is sort of a Trinity thing going on. You've got Gandalf planning salvation, you have Frodo accomplishing salvation, and you have Aragorn inspiring salvation in the people. He's the one that gets all the orcs to come out of Mordor so Sam and Frodo can transport themselves unmolested to Mordor, or, you know, to the volcano. Yeah. So you see all this going on, and you see that these three figures actually comprise together a character that we would call a Christ figure, but they each have a little piece of Christ. He didn't want a strict allegory. He wanted something that was more of a parable of, say, Jesus's story.
Something to incite the moral imagination. I'm hearing a lot of people talk about that. It's the importance of that moral imagination there. And one of the really cool and unique things about Lord of the Rings, maybe that would be different from what we see in the Marvel movies or what we might see in something like Wonder Woman or Star Wars, is that the heroes of the story in Lord of the Rings are these kind of little hobbits that they're kind of weak. They're not very strong. They're not particularly like eloquent or philosophically sophisticated or any of that. Why do you think he chose the hobbits to be the heroes?
That's, I think, where his true Christian colors show through. Through weakness, evil will be overturned. In fact, Gandalf even says it. He says, "It's not by strength of arms we will win this. It's through weakness." And so if you look at the Bible, and we point this out in Hollywood Heroes, think about how many characters in the Bible are weak. And they, of course, Jesus is the ultimate one. He gives up all his power and saves the world. But you can think of other weak characters. I mean, Paul says, when I'm weak, I am strong. Peter, denies Christ 3 times and runs away at the crucifixion. And, he putting his foot in his mouth all the time. Matthew's a tax collector. Nobody likes him, but he writes the gospel. John is just a kid who travels with Jesus, and he writes the gospel. Mark can't even complete a missionary journey with Paul. Paul gets so upset, he kicks him out, but yet then he gets with Peter and writes the gospel. I mean, these are weak people. These are not superheroes. And of course, that's what Tolkien is saying, is that evil can be overcome with weakness. Evil can be overcome with sacrifice. And the same thing is true today. God uses the weak. God doesn't need superstars. He uses everyday people to get his will done.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember now. It's been a while since I've watched Lord of the Rings, but there was something to it also that I'm trying to remember. Maybe you can remember this, where when Gandalf himself wouldn't even touch the ring.
That's right.
And he was saying that only a hobbit, because of, I don't know, was it the purity of heart, or there's something about it that would make him a little bit more resistant to the power of the ring. And maybe was it that hobbits weren't seeking power, maybe? I can't remember. Do you remember?
Well, yeah, I think that maybe hobbits had a different nature, and that's probably why Gandalf said that. Everyone else is susceptible, because I think the ring represented the power of sin in our lives, although Tolkien left that up to the reader to determine that. But I remember even when, some of the hobbits got a hold of the ring. I remember one scene where I can't remember who it was, got the ring, and suddenly his eyes got real big, like,
Bilbo
I must
Baggins.
be mine. It happens to Frodo at the very end, right?
It's a terrifying scene. You don't see it coming, and his face becomes all demonic and crazy for a second. Yeah.
That's what sin does to you. Now, you mentioned Gollum earlier, right? Yeah. Gollum he has the ring, and it's just precious, right? But he but it destroys him, right? It totally destroys him. And that's what sin does. It destroys you. And by the way, this is similar in the Star Wars series. Notice that the evil side they're physically deformed, right? So Darth Vader's physically deformed. He's like half man, half machine. He's on a breathing machine, right? The Emperor, his face is all deformed because that represents the fact that he's evil. And so Lucas communicated the people who were morally evil had something physically wrong with them, whereas someone like Luke he's good, he's pure, right? He's handsome. And so that was the way he communicated the difference between good and evil. And we even see that in the Lord of the Rings series, same kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember being a little girl and my mom took us to the theater to see, I think it was, I don't know, was it Empire Strikes Back maybe or something like that. And I just remember her having this little talk with us, like, now they move things with their mind. So, just, you can't do that. Don't try that. And of course, the first thing I did when I got home was, I try to like get a book from the bookshelf to come over to me.
You lifted mom right off the couch, didn't you?
I tried so hard. But, I liked that my parents kind of did that with us with even, watching the Smurfs. She would explain the magic involved and, how we can think about that as Christians. And, but thinking about Star Wars is a very interesting one because this is one where, as our friend Richard Howe has pointed out, he's got some articles on this on his website and he's given lectures on this, that Star Wars is very, very religious in nature. In fact, in an interview with, I believe it was maybe Time magazine, George Lucas basically said, I was going for pluralism. I wanted the Hindus to watch this and find their religion reflected. I wanted the Christians to see it. Yeah. I wanted the Muslims and the Buddhists, and I wanted everybody to see this movie and be able to filter it through their own worldview. And essentially, when we analyze the worldview of Star Wars, we're going to land somewhere in pantheism, of course, with the Force being kind of like Chi and Taoism and things like that. But there's still this good versus evil that, as to borrow from Frank Turek, that borrows from the Christian worldview, right? This sense of this deep Judeo-Christian ethic as far as sacrifice and hard work and good versus evil and good winning out. So there's so many places we can go, but Anakin Skywalker is one of those really fascinating characters that we saw the moral arc really evolve more in those later movies that you were mentioning, you took Zach to later. But what does his fall to the dark side, essentially there's all this debate about should we even train Jedis anymore because after Anakin, we see him go to the dark side when he had so much promise. But what can that teach us maybe about something like the nature of sin?
Well, I think sin is deceitful. Of course, that's what the scripture talks about. And James, the half-brother of Jesus, says, each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. And here the word enticed means to be to catch by use of bait. And this is what happens to Anakin. He's enticed by his own desires and emotions. He's ruled mainly by fear. He doesn't want to lose his worldly attachments, as Yoda put it. He doesn't want to lose his family, obviously. He doesn't want to lose his power. And at one point, Alisa, he's told to be rational. He says, you're asking me to be rational. That is something I know I cannot do. Believe me, I wish I could. I just can't wish away my feelings, but he can't. And he goes down this road of sin after he's enticed and he gives into it. And then it's a regressive road to the point where not only he's doing evil, but he's cheering on other people who are doing evil. It's perfectly the description of what you see in Romans 1. Once you start doing evil, you get a depraved mind and you begin doing more evil until the point where you're cheering on other people who are doing evil. Then he's committing war crimes. And he actually gives in to the Sith Lord, who turns out to be the Emperor, after he's supposed to be fighting that guy. He's supposed to be fighting the Sith, right? But instead, as soon as the Sith Emperor says, look, I'm really a Sith. I'm not on your side, but I can give you everything you want. You can keep your power. You can keep your family. You can keep all that. Anakin just gives in, and that's when he becomes Darth Vader, right? So it can happen to us as well. We get enticed and dragged away, and that's what happened. Now, fast forward. After Luke spoiler alert, Luke is the son.
If you don't already know.
That's right. If you don't already know. I just put a little magic in there just in case. Okay.
Very good.
If in case you don't know, Luke redeems him, his father, and then he starts dragging him toward a spaceship to rescue him. So Darth Vader was trying to drag Luke to the dark side, but it's fitting that after Luke wins, he's trying to drag his father to safety. And of course he says, "It's too late for me now, son," you know. But I have to save you, father. You already have, son. Tell your sister you were right. Right.
Yeah.
And then what do we see after that? Darth Vader is alive. He's transfigured with Yoda and Obi-Wan.
That's right.
What does that sound like?
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to bring up, because one of the really cool things about the whole Star Wars thing, especially maybe those earliest ones too, I think, is that you did have this idea of the afterlife being very Christianish in its portrayal of heaven, of course, with Yoda there, and then you do see Anakin redeemed, and it's interesting that it would do that. It was like that bad people, like a person who'd done so much evil their whole life, this would kind of be the opposite of cancel culture, can end up redeemed in the end, and that is a message that I think is lost on our culture.
Well, we have in the Star Wars chapter in Hollywood Heroes, we have a section, "Can bad people go to heaven?" Like Darth Vader. And our conclusion is only bad people go to heaven.
Yeah.
Right? There are no good people.
Yeah.
We all go to heaven because of what Jesus has done. None of us make it there on our merit. So yeah, everybody goes to heaven who wants to, if they've accepted what the free gift of salvation is that Jesus provides. If they don't want to accept Christ's life, if they don't want to be with him now, they're not going to want to be with him in eternity. So God doesn't force anybody into heaven against their will.
Okay, let's talk about Harry Potter, because I think this is probably the one, my suspicion is this is going to be the one you're going to get the most pushback on in the book. And I'll just tell you, like, as a parent, Harry Potter was something I really wanted to avoid. And I have lots of reasons. Many of our viewers and listeners have heard my interview with Jack Marino, who came out of the occult. And she talks about how she was initially enticed into the occult by Disney and by the Fantasia movie. And a lot of the things that she was exposed to as a child, these ended up enticing her into those things. And we look around and like Wicca is on the rise. I think there's more young people attracted to the occult than ever. I think it would be a fair guess to say that Harry Potter probably played a huge role. You have this place called Hogwarts where it's magical and it's so beautiful, and you go learn magic and actually witchcraft, calling it witchcraft, all these things. So because of those things, I was always really hesitant to introduce my kids to Harry Potter. So I never did, but of course they're gonna hear about it. And so my daughter had a good friend who was really into Harry Potter, and then I had a choice to make, and I was like, well, do I do the thing where I say we're not going to do that in this house, or do I say, okay, look, we're going to discern this through together? And so where I landed with my daughter was I just said, okay, here's the thing. Yes, you can read the books, but let's read them together, because I had actually already read all of the books. It was like research in the beginning, and then I'm like, oh, the next one's coming out, and then before I know it, I'm in line at Barnes and Noble at midnight for the new release. I'm just admitting that to you, but so I'd already read them for research purposes. And so I was like,
for those of you listening to the podcast, research purposes, Alisa has her quote fingers up.
Yes, that's right. My quote fingers for research purposes. So, so I was like, well, okay, we'll read these. And there was also, this is the age appropriate thing to consider with something like Harry Potter. They're really terrifying in certain spots, especially as you get further into the series. So there's all that to consider. But ultimately, I thought, well, I would rather remove the mystique from it and teach her to discern through it, because I remembered that as a young child, walking by my dad's desk and seeing a Book of Mormon on my dad's desk. And I remember thinking, I knew that it was a different faith's religious book.
Mm-hmm.
But I asked my dad about it, and I was like, why do you have that? And he's like, well, I'm curious what they believe. I want to know what they believe.
Sure.
And I said, well, is it true? And he goes, no, what we believe is true, but I want to know what they believe. And there was something about that just, it removed all mystique. I was never, from that point on, ever attracted to Mormonism. I never considered it as a worldview. It was just kind of like, oh, okay, I don't have to be afraid of that. So I think there's an element of that where we can teach our kids to discern through within. Even part of that is teaching them not to be enticed by how much they're romanticizing witchcraft. So that's my little spiel leading up to Harry Potter. But with that said, what are some of the observations that you made, about the Harry Potter series and how that can actually be used as a conversation starter for people?
Yeah, again, I defer to parents. Whatever they think is right with their kids, you got to make your own decisions. But if you look at Harry Potter, you see arguably, and this is what we say in the book, the character Harry Potter has more in common with the life of Christ than any other character in modern fiction. You go, what? How can that be? Here are just 4 things that are true about Harry Potter's life. Number 1, he's prophesied as the savior before he's born. Does that sound familiar? Secondly, he has to live a moral life in order to achieve his messiahship, to be the savior. Thirdly, he has to die in order to achieve it. And fourthly, he rises from the dead to achieve it. So he's prophesied, he lives a moral life, he dies, and he rises from the dead. And then his friends have to put their faith in him in order to overcome the evil Voldemort. Now, you go,
wow.
How can, those parallels are, why are they parallels? Because J.K. Rowling actually said that the entire series can be epitomized by 2 Bible verses, which she put in the book.
Wow.
And in the movie. The 2 Bible verses are the last enemy to be destroyed is death, from 1 Corinthians 15. That's actually found on the tombstone of Harry Potter's parents.
Wow.
And the other passage is where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. She says those 2 Bible verses epitomize the entire story. She says Dumbledore is the John the Baptist figure to Harry's Christ. And
so she said that. She said that?
Oh, she says it.
Wow.
Yeah, she says it all.
Yeah.
Because she says, look, these are very British books. You're going to find Harry finding biblical references, but I never wanted to talk much about it because I did not want the readers to get tipped off as to where we were going with all this.
That's fascinating.
Now you say, okay, well, what about the the witchcraft in there? These are fantasy movies, and 20 out of the top 25 movies of all time, every single one of them, maybe with the exception of 2, are either fantasy movies that have either the supernatural or the paranormal in them. Okay, the only 2 that I think that don't are Titanic and maybe Furious 7, which has a bunch of special effects in it, right? It's kind of fantasy anyway, right?
Yeah.
Now, I notice Christians are really upset over Harry Potter. Again, I defer to parents on this, but I don't notice the same Christians being upset over Lord of the Rings. Gandalf is a wizard.
Yeah.
He's doing the occult too.
Yeah. That's what I actually, even when I read Narnia, was like, I would be so confused by the witchcraft in all of those books. So yeah, I mean, I get that. I'm sympathetic to people who are like, but you're right. There are a lot of people who are like, yeah, no on Harry Potter, but yes on Narnia and Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah. That's one of the points. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, these are meant to be fantasy stories. You need to explain to children they are fantasy stories. And you also need to explain that the occult is, while it's real, the kind of occult that's in the Lord, or that's in Harry Potter is not real. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't see people zapping other people or flying on broomsticks, just like we don't see people levitating spaceships with their minds, right? We don't. I know you tried it when you got home, Alisa, but after you saw Star Wars or Empire Strikes Back. But these are fantasy movies. They're not meant to be real. But we can still see the storyline under it. In fact, here's what Rowling says. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing her name right. Rowling.
I think that's right.
Rowling, maybe more like Rowling. But anyway, she lately has been, a side note, she's not backing down to the trans people
Right.
on,
Yeah,
she's just saying, hey, women are women. If,
that's right.
if you're going to say the trans people are right, you've just erased women, because if there are no genders, there are no women. Anyway,
Yeah.
here's what she says about the whole magical thing. And I'm paraphrasing her now. She says, magic lifts the imagination, but magic isn't the center of the story. Human nature is. And here's her quote. She says, Harry enters this magical world and he thinks it will be an escape, but it's not. Human nature is human nature, whether or not you can use a wand. So the whole thing is that the magic in the movie is designed to give kids power that kids don't have, right? They can do this magic and it enthralls them, but that's not the center of the story. The center of the story isn't the occult. The center of the story isn't magic. The center of the story is you're going to have to overcome evil with good. And Harry Potter is going to have to do it. Harry Potter is going to have to be the savior. He's the one that can take the stone to parallel the ring in Lord of the Rings. He's the one that can take it and not be corrupted by it. He's the one that can look into the mirror of Ersed and can reveal his true nature. Whereas the other people, it reveals their nature too, but they're not good. They can't deal with it. So it's really more about sacrifice, morality, death, resurrection. That's what it's really all about. And all the magic in there is just the vehicle through which Rowling actually gets the job done.
And I think too, if we just have those open conversations with our kids, and I think it's even great to say, hey, look, there's a lot of people of your generation that are being really attracted to these things of the occult, but here's where we're going to show you what's real about that, what's not real, what's just a fantasy part of that, and what's not. And just teaching our kids to discern through those things, I think, is a really powerful way to teach them really to interact with the world as they get out into the world and be able, and that could even, in some ways, I wonder, insulate them from becoming attracted to Wicca or something like that, because it's been talked through. This isn't something that's new and mysterious in a way.
Let me say something to that, Alisa, because that's such a good point. I want to relate something that I learned from Josh McDowell years ago. Our mutual friend Josh McDowell and his son Sean. When Sean was just a little kid, Josh would take him downtown and they would look at graffiti on a city wall, all the worst graffiti. And Josh would say, son, you see what that says over there? Let me explain to you what that means. Okay. This is vulgar. This is not good. This is demeaning people. This is not what you want to do, because you're made in the image of God and so are other people. So he would explain all of this to Sean. So there was no mystery to Sean when these things came up. Oh, I know what that means. Okay. My wife, Stephanie's really good at bringing kids up, and she would talk to kids directly all the time about issues related to sexuality and these drugs and all these things. And because look, if you avoid those topics or you freak out when they come up, what, your kid's not going to come to you and ask you for your advice. Mom's going to freak out if we talk about this. But if you talk about it in a measured way and say, yeah, you want to talk about this? Let's talk. Then your kids are going to come to you. So
I think that's
all
so
these
good.
things I think we have to educate our children on, and hiding from it is not the way.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's funny on that point. I think my parents did a really good job with that, too. And it's like our friends Brett Kunkle and John Stonestreet write in their book, A Practical Guide to Culture, that especially when it comes to issues surrounding sexuality and, the way that the culture is navigating that, make yourself the Google with your kids so that they won't go to Google. And that's just going to take an ongoing type of openness and conversation, not freaking out, not being reactionary. And I've seen good fruit in that in my own life, but I'll end with this little story because this makes the point of the age appropriate thing. So when my daughter was little, she wanted to know what all the cuss words were because she had heard them, like the S word and there's the F word, and she was like, "Mom, what are they? Like, what are the words?" And so I said, "All right, I'm going to tell you what the words are, okay? But I don't want you to use them, but I don't want you to have to wonder what they are. So here's what they are."
It's
so I told
friends, honey. It's friends.
Yes, friends, and yeah, exactly. So I told her the words, and she's been great. Like now, she'll ask me all sorts of things, like, "Hey, the kids were talking about this at school. What is that?" And I've had to explain some things to my daughter that I wish I wouldn't have had to. But if she knows that she can count on me to be dead honest about it. All right, here's what that means.
Mhm.
This is what they're talking about. Now, my son, on the other hand, he wanted to know all the cuss words. So I was like, going to do this great parenting thing like I did with her and told him the words. Oh, he uses them all the time, Frank.
How old is he?
Oh, he's 10. And he'll even threaten, like, he'd probably kill me if he knew I was saying this, but I'll hear him yelling at my daughter and he'll say, get out of my room or I'm going to say the F word to you. And he'll threaten like that he's going to say it. So, there may be a little bit of an age appropriate thing there too. Although I'm still glad I did it because he's going to hear him anyway. But then you just got to navigate the rest of it. But can you believe we're about out of time? This has just flown by. Such a fun topic. I was really hoping to get to wonder. Yeah, please.
I wanted to say one thing before, because you brought up a point at the beginning of the show about, age appropriate. And you also pointed out that, our parents have a tendency to isolate kids from things. Too often, I think parents make the decision as to whether or not their kids can watch it. If there's sex, if there's violence in it, okay, maybe no. If they're bad words, maybe no. But you know what we often do? We often say, oh, if it doesn't have any of that in, then they can watch it. Well, then they watch like a Disney movie, which basically says, follow your heart, follow your heart, follow your heart. And that's a worse message than if they heard a couple of cuss words.
I agree.
Right?
Totally agree.
And that's why the Iron Man series is so good. Don't follow your heart. Look, Iron Man, Tony Stark has everything and he's not happy. Ask your kids, why is Tony Stark not happy? He's got everything to live with, nothing to live for, right?
Yeah.
Sex, money, and power are not going to make you happy. So don't go down that road to make you happy. There's a difference between pleasure and happiness. Yes. Pleasure's good, but it won't necessarily bring you happiness.
Yeah.
So you got to follow God ultimately. Now, I know all these Marvel movies, they just make passing references to God and they put all value in relationships with people. If we do that, if we put all our value in relationships with people, we're not going to be happy either. We've got to put our ultimate happiness or our ultimate relationship with God. And then once we get that straightened out, then everything else will go better with our horizontal relationships.
That's true. And I think that's the opportunity as well. Just even as Christians, as we watch these movies and as we talk about them with our friends and the people in our circles, and even as parents talk about them with their kids, is that there's some really great themes to talk about that point to the gospel. But there's also some stuff that we can say, okay, yeah, this person did this and that was good, but then this person did this and that's bad. That doesn't agree with reality. That doesn't line up with truth. And just to be able to spot all of those messages.
Not the lie.
Yeah, it's spot the lie. Exactly. Nothing's going to get it all completely right. Well, we've about run out of time here, but I do want to let people know that you can go to patreon.com/Alisa Childers, and there you can find some exclusive content, some bonus content. And one of the bonus contents you're going to find is that we're about to have a little after party hangout for 5 or 10 minutes where people in the Patreon group get to ask the questions of our guests. So we're going to do a little bit extra. I want to talk about Wonder Woman a little bit with Frank because that's one of my favorites is the first one. Didn't like the second one so much, kind of for different reasons. But we're going to talk about that. But Frank, as we close out this portion of our discussion here, what do we wrap this up with? Ultimately, we're not just looking at all these movies to find the Jesus in the movie. There's something we're trying to get to, and that's that this whole story of dying and going to heaven, living for good, looking at Jesus as our Savior. I mean, this is really what we're trying to point to. So why do we need a Savior? Can't you just be good and go to heaven? I mean, why does this all matter anyway?
Yeah, excellent point. The reason we can't be good and go to heaven is because none of us have been good completely. And if God is infinitely just, and he is, then he can't allow injustice to go unpunished. He has to punish us. So instead of punishing us, he punishes himself, basically. That way he can remain just and justify sinners like you and me. You see, this is why Jesus is the only way. It's not an arbitrary claim. It's not like Jesus saying, I'm the only way because I said so. No, that's the only way an infinitely just being can reconcile his infinite justice and his infinite love. What he does is he punishes himself in our place. And just simply by accepting that, then you are not only forgiven, you're given his righteousness. And by doing that, then you have eternal life and will be with Christ and your loved ones who have also accepted that forever. Those that don't want that, they want to stay separate from Christ. Well, you'll stay separate from Christ for all eternity. He's not going to force you into heaven against your will. And so we point all this out in Hollywood Heroes. And the last chapter deals with the ultimate hero, Jesus. And why is Jesus different although similar to some of the superheroes. That's what we cover in the last chapter.
Very good. Well, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Frank Turek. Go get the book, Hollywood Heroes. It's available wherever books are sold. Just came out this week. So go out and get that. Let's get them a really good opening week with great sales to cue all of the algorithms that people like this, and it will go into the news feeds of more people. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, subscribe. If you're listening on audio platforms, leaving a 5-star review really helps get the message out. And of course, if you liked this episode and you want to share it, don't just send it to your friends via email. Share it on social media. Let's get the word out there. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.